Hope you're enjoying your time on the island. I have so far seen 3 lizards. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of a lizard stalker. So I'm going to start off today with a horror story, and I think that'll be a nice way to start off everything. But I'll try and have a happy ending at the end. So this is about an experience I had with Twitter Bootstrap while working at Coursera. So first, some background. I joined Coursera about a year ago. Have any of you used Coursera before? Cool, all right. So Coursera offers these classes online from universities, and we've got a huge range of classes. So we do have, the really nerdy classes like machine learning and probabilistic graphical models, which I still don't know what they are. But then we've got stuff like the history of rock, canine therogenology, which is how dogs reproduce, which apparently is really actually important to people that reproduce dogs for a living. And so we've got a huge range of courses on this website. And so what I have been working on since I joined was making it possible for people to browse courses and take courses and learn and all that good stuff, right? So when I joined Coursera, of course, I was curious about how the Coursera stack worked and what it used behind the scenes. So we had a modern stack, which was our backbone JS, which was backed by a Python Django API. But then, of course, I discovered we have a legacy code base. And our legacy code base is the code base that started it all. That was the prototype, right? Because there were some Stanford professors who said, oh, I'd really like to put my classes online. And they had their grad students sitting there, and they're like, hey, you grad students, make me a web app. So the grad students made them a web app using what they knew of as the best way, and that was using PHP and MySQL and a custom PHP routing and templating and SQL query library, and everything was custom. And so that's our legacy code base. And that is actually what the majority of our code is in this code base. So I avoided that code base for as long as I could. I played in the modern code base for as long as possible. I was like, oh, I'm going to add this to this, and this to this, and this to this. And then one day I was like, I can't just avoid this legacy code base forever. It was kind of this thing like looming in the back of my head. Like, I know I need to get in there because that's the stuff that I really want to change, because that's where you do all your learning, is in that code base. So eventually I decided that I wanted to actually get into that code base and tackle it. But I discovered that we actually had a lot of bootstraps that we're using across the code base. So our modern app was just using Bootstrap 2.1, but in the legacy code base, I found that we're using Bootstrap 1, and we were even using Bootstrap 2.0 in some places. So we had 3 different bootstraps across the code bases, and that's bad because it meant that it was really hard to reuse things across the code bases, right? So I couldn't reuse the same JavaScript libraries, I couldn't reuse the same CSS, I couldn't reuse anything, right? So the first step for me to getting into that code base was to unify the bootstraps across them. Now I think it's obvious why it's bad to have that many bootstraps, but I have done a bit of scientific studies into a number of bootstraps in developer happiness, and this is based on a careful survey. So, you could be okay with 0 bootstrap, and you could make your own CSS and all that stuff, but of course we like bootstrap because it gives us a nice basis for prettiness. So, 1 bootstrap is really, really great, right? But as you approach infinite number of bootstraps, yeah, it gets really bad. So I don't know why there's so many bootstraps, God. So there's my science for the talk. So I filed a little Jira issue that said, port to Bootstrap 2. And I thought it was going to be easy. I had ported previous apps to Bootstrap 2, and it was just one of those things you did, when you had a couple hours free and you were watching a crappy TV show, which is all I watch. And I was like, this is easy. I'm just going to do it on one of my Caltrain rides to and from the city. And so I started. And I just started by following the upgrade guide. And this upgrade guide will tell you what the new classes were. So from Bootstrap 1 to 2, I don't know how many of you have been through this process. Or raise your hand if you've ever upgraded Bootstrap. Wow, you guys are lucky. All right. So from Bootstrap 1 to 2, they changed a bunch of the class names. They added some, removed some. They changed the way some of the JavaScript work. And so they had this upgrade guide which showed you how to upgrade from 1 to 2. And it's funny because they actually took down this upgrade guide at one point because they thought nobody else was upgrading. I was like, hey, hold up. You got to put that upgrade guide back. There's going to be people upgrading for like years and years to come. So I've started following it, right? Which mostly meant looking for class names and replacing them with new class names. So first thing I realized was that it was going to take me longer than a train ride. Right? So 2 days later, you can see all my commits over 2 days. I was basically going through each of the different parts of Bootstrap. So upgrading the table, and then the button, and then the grids, and then the forms, and then the tabs, the pills, the alerts, the popovers, right? Just going one by one through the guide. But after 2 days, I realized that this was not a job for a train ride. This was going to take me a bit longer. Because I was still only through like the first half of the upgrade guide, and I hadn't even touched our JavaScript at all, because there's also Bootstrap JavaScript, and it turns out we were using the Bootstrap JavaScript too. So I kind of had to put this off for a bit and work on it on the side. And a month later, I got back into it and started doing more and more stuff. And then I realized, like, wow, this is a big thing I've taken on. I discovered my code base was bigger than I thought it was, and that this was actually going to be a lot trickier. So I got kind of tired doing it by myself, and I brought in some colleagues, right? This is what I've kind of realized every time I try and rewrite something at Coursera, is that it's really hard to do it on your own, and it gets really exhausting. And sometimes you got to bring in colleagues and people to do it with you, because they can give you the energy to keep going. Because it's not a really glamorous and exciting thing, because at the end of the day, my goal was for it to be exactly the same. So if I did my job right, nothing will change and nothing will break. So it's one of those things that is so not glamorous, but something you really, really want to get done. And stuff like that, sometimes you just got to bring in recruits to help you out, right? So I started getting my colleagues to jump in, and one of the things I do when I want to get my colleagues to jump in is I have athons. So you can basically take a thon and put it at the end of anything, right? So we have testathons and perfathons and scalathons. So for this one, I had a Bootstrap V2-athon. I know it rolls off the tongue. But I was like, listen guys, it's really, really fun. We sit in a room and we upgrade Bootstrap. And we look at every single page in the site, and we check to see that it's working. So my colleagues really enjoyed this athon. Luckily, we work across the street from a party store, so we just go to the party store and we bring back like balloons and inflatable sharks, and we're like, come on, if you come to the athon, you can have an inflatable shark, which works surprisingly well. So we had an athon. We actually had a couple of athons, and that helped a lot. It got a lot done. And so after we were done making what we thought were all the fixes, we sent it to QA. Because at this point, I didn't have the confidence that we'd actually gotten everything and that everything was well done. But I was also kind of tired. So we have a QA team that we sent it to, and we gave them 2 staging servers. And so they just went through every page and just looked back and forth between Bootstrap 1 and 2. And remember, the goal is that it should look exactly the same. So they gave us, this is only part of the Jira issue. So there was like 60 screenshots in this issue that they filed with all the differences. And so we had to go through each of them and make the fixes. So that took about a week of QA. And finally, after the week of QA, I was like, all right, OK, I think we're ready. I think we can do this. And so then we had what I call a deploy-a-thon. Which is where we sit in the office and deploy code that I'm too scared to deploy by myself. So this usually involves some sort of alcohol, too. I usually have my colleagues press the button, because I have like a mini heart attack if I press the deploy button. So finally, a month after I filed that issue, I got it out, right? And you can see my final pull request was 97 commits, 346 files changed. And I think it was something like 4,000 additions and 4,000 deletions. So it turned out to be kind of a big pull request and kind of a big change. And I might have taken the opportunity to redo some of the rest of our architecture at the same time. And we only had one big issue that came out of it, and that was just a mistake with this silly JavaScript. in our system. So we kind of measure our deploys by the number of postmortems that come out of them, because we always write postmortems. So I only had one postmortem, which was, yeah, okay. So that was the ordeal, right? And I did not expect it to be that hard, right? I thought this was going to be a fun thing that I did on the train, and I'd get off the train and be like, yeah, I upgraded Bootstrap, woohoo! But it wasn't, right? And why was it that hard? So there were a few reasons, right? So first of all, our code base was a lot bigger than I thought it was, because when I joined Coursera, my only experience with Coursera was as a student, right? I had taken the HCI class, and I knew that, oh, there's these quizzes you take and these lectures you watch, and there's not that much, right? But then I discovered that 90% of our app is an admin interface, right? Because the teachers have to create the classes and upload and create the quizzes and all that stuff, and I had never seen that before. So in doing this process, part of it was good because I got a chance to see everything in our code base. It is actually a pretty good way of getting familiar with every single part of your code base. So we had something like 200 PHP template files, 350 controller files, 143 JavaScript files, and 25 CSS files, right? So this was a lot of files to look through because maybe basically I was looking for Bootstrap usage across all of these different files. And the thing was that we were using Bootstrap class names everywhere, right? So you would think that, oh, just look in your template files, that'll be good enough. No. We had PHP utility libraries that were generating, of course, your classic form generating functions, right? We had a lot of those, right? This is our little form helper class. So we had class names in our HTML, in our CSS, in our PHP, and the worst, of course, is the PHP that outputs JavaScript that has class names in it. Ugh. So I had to look everywhere for these class names, right? And of course, Bootstrap does not have very greppable class names, right? Try looking for, alert across your code base. I found 80. But try looking for info, because it was button info was their V1 class name. 1,000 places is where info is mentioned, because info is kind of a generic thing that we use everywhere, right? So these were not very easy to grep for, and I'm like really bad at grepping, right? But every time I tweet about it, my dad is like, no, it's not that hard. So I can't even whine about how hard it is to grep things. So really hard to grep these Bootstrap class names in that big of a code base. And of course, Bootstrap wasn't just CSS, it was JavaScript, and we were using that JavaScript, and we had modified that JavaScript, and we needed to get it to working exactly correct again, and it had to be accessible and all that stuff. So a lot of our changes in the end were all around the JavaScript and getting that JavaScript functionality working exactly the way it worked before. So that's why it was hard. Now, I've thought about, after going through this process, I thought about what would actually make this better. And I came up with a lot of different things that would have made this experience better. And some of these are things that we've already started doing. Other things are things that I would love for us to do in an ideal world where we had enough time. So hopefully this is the sort of stuff that you can think about for your apps, and especially if you're starting your app now from day one, right? You can actually start off with these practices in place so that a year later when you have more engineers join, it's going to be pleasant for them to upgrade to Bootstrap 300 million. So the first thing that seems kind of obvious is that the way we were using PHP was kind of horrible, right? PHP outputting JavaScript, outputting CSS, and HTML is pretty bad. And the reason that can be really bad in this case is because it means there were so many places I had to look in order to find where we're using class names, right? I had to look in PHP classes for this stuff, right? And we actually had, we'd have a line, which is our HTML, and then the next line would be a SQL query statement, right? So if I did a grep and replace wrong, I could accidentally mess up a SQL query statement, right? Replacing your CSS class name should not end up in you accidentally changing SQL. That's bad. So generally, it's better if you can separate your concerns better. So that's why we have our new architecture uses Backbone.js, and then Jade for our HTML templates, and Stylus for our CSS. And our API is completely separate from that, right? So at least I have some degree of faith in the new architecture that I'm not going to end up changing the data that comes back. But of course, another thing that's important besides having a better architecture is to try and only have one architecture. So this is another one of these highly scientific graphs. But basically, I think one architecture is good to have. And the problem is the more and more architectures you have, the harder it is to come up with best practices and conventions, and the harder it is for me to figure out how each of the architectures work and where I should look inside of them, right? So this is one of the things we've been trying, we've been experimenting with a couple architectures, and we're converging on one. But right now, we kind of have a handful of them. But now there are things that would have made it a lot easier if Twitter Bootstrap itself was different, right? So one thing is that Bootstrap has these incredibly ambiguous names, short names: alert, label, button. So one thing would have been amazing is if they had been namespaced, right? If they were just TBS-alert, that would have been a lot easier for me to grep for, right? And there is actually an issue that has been filed on the Bootstrap issue tracker about auto-prefixing all the Bootstrap classes. Unfortunately, they decided that they're kind of not that into it. I think it's a hipster thing. So we're probably not going to have Bootstrap appending namespaces to their class names anytime soon. But there's a lot of people that are interested in this because it, would things make better. So there's multiple blog posts out there about how to auto-prefix the Bootstrap classes. So there's one about doing it with less. There's another one about doing it in Sass. So if you're using one of these preprocessor frameworks, it can make it a lot easier for you to actually get Bootstrap namespace in your own code, right? So I would highly recommend looking into that. I think it would be amazing if the Bootstrap team decided to prefix it for everything, because I worry that 5 years from now, there's going to be all these code bases that have this alert class name in them everywhere, and there's going to be somebody sitting there like me trying to grep for it and wishing that they had been namespaced, right? So the thing about Bootstrap is that it is used by so many websites today that anything that they do as a default will become the default on those websites. So we can be, good, conscientious people and try and prefix ours, but the majority of people probably won't. So if you can convince them to fulfill that issue, it would be amazing. But one thing I've tried to try doing is just to avoid using those Bootstrap class names directly entirely, right? So ideally in our CSS, we would only ever have Coursera CSS classes. And those Coursera classes would simply extend from the Bootstrap classes. And you can do this if you use a preprocessor. So we, internally at Coursera, we use the Bootstrap stylus port, but Bootstrap is written in less, so you can also use the original less. So if I want to extend the button, I just create my class and say which button classes extends. And then I also, at least in stylus, have to define it for the hover state as well, and say that those extend the button hover states. But then I have this CSS class name that I can use, and I can just swap out what it's extending from behind the scenes, right? So this seems kind of ideal, because this kind of means that if you were only ever using your own class names, you're not dependent on somebody else's class names. You could theoretically swap out a different framework behind the scenes, right? And that seems really promising. Like if one day, you decide that Zerb is better, or there's this new crazy thing that one of you guys is working on and you come out with, you just swap it behind the scenes. So I've only started doing this in a few places because it takes a while to start coming up with new practices and implementing them. But I do generally think this is a really cool approach. And then what it would be great is, and this is something we thought about doing as well, is having your own internal style guides that show all the classes that you're using. So imagine when you go to Bootstrap and you see this is our grid and this is our button classes, this and this. Copy that, but just do it with your own classes. So anybody developing or designing can look at this style guide and see, oh, right, these are all the classes we should be using, right? So they're not looking at the Bootstrap docs anymore. They're looking at your style guide. So I think that would be awesome as well. Another thing that I've started to do is to stop using class names directly in our JavaScript libraries, right? Because one of the big things about this upgrade was that we were using our JavaScript, and I'd have to go through and upgrade everything in the JavaScript as well, and everything was dependent on these class names. So we've started writing our own JavaScript libraries, and we tend not to even use the Bootstrap ones anymore. And these JavaScript libraries will specify a CSS prefix in the default options and pass those into all the templates. So the templates, we use them for the libraries. So you can see like our Jade template says, okay, this class is going to be prefix plus dash toolbar. And then when we use this library, we specify that the prefix is going to be Coursera dash WYSI HTML5, right? So then in our CSS, we can define what that will look like. So now we have full control over what those classes are and exactly how namespaced they are. So I think this is a nice technique as well, and gives you a lot more flexibility to namespace your classes however you wish. And there's an article about that as well. And another idea that I've seen talked about in some blogs is just not to use class names in your JavaScript, right? Because one of the things we see is that we're not just using CSS classes for our styling. We're using CSS classes for JavaScript often, right? We're saying, OK, whenever something with this class name is clicked on, we're going to do this action, right? So that means if you're changing a CSS style, you could potentially break JavaScript, all right? Which means you could potentially break your entire site. You could change a CSS style and rename it, and suddenly nobody can sign up on your site because you were listening to a click event on the wrong class name, right? So this game sounded kind of scary because it means that CSS is doing a lot, right? So one thing you could do is two different approaches. One is that you could have class names that were specifically for JS, right? So I could have Coursera-submit-js, and that -js at the mean could mean to me, oh, wow, if I change this, I know that I'm changing this thing that's used by JS, right? So it would be like a convention so that you knew that was just for JS and not for styling, right? And then in your view, you could listen just on the -js classes. Another approach is just to use data attributes, right? And I've started doing these in some places. So if you use data attributes, and so you might have like data-js action, and then in your view, you're just going to hook into that data attribute instead, right? So these are just techniques to make sure that you're not using a CSS class both for styling and for functionality, because it just introduces a whole other realm of things that can break if you decide to change that class name. Now, of course, testing, all right? This is one of the big problems with our old code base, is that it was completely and utterly untested. I think it's at 2% coverage now. So if it had a testing framework in place, then I wouldn't have been so nervous about releasing it and deploying it, right? I would have just run the test and went, oh, beautiful, everything works. I don't have to worry. But it didn't, so I had to set it through that week of manual QA. So it's really, really important to test your front end, especially as we're doing more and more stuff in our front end, right? Before, our front ends were dumb and our servers were the smart ones. But now our front ends can do a lot, which means you need to be testing them a lot. And a lot of times you actually have to be testing them even more than you would think so, because if you've got JavaScript hooked up to your front end, then you don't just have to test the, like, you know, that they click there and something happens. You have to test like sequences of events that can happen as well, right? So testing is really, really important. So we use a combination of Mocha and Chai and JSDOM to load in our views and to render them and to simulate clicking on them and to check what is visible then and check that things are shown and check the content and the size and all of that stuff. So now we can run this code over all of our backbone views and make sure that they work. We don't really have that for our PHP templates yet, but one day when we just rewrite everything, we will. And we also have some Selenium tests as well, and Selenium tests will open up a full browser and do the entire integration test from sign up to log in to view the page, right? So that's the ultimate, because it emulates exactly what the user is doing. But the basic point is that if your front end is doing anything, it needs to be tested, right? So this is something that I wish we had had from the beginning, and something that takes time to do, right? So once again, this is a great opportunity for a testathon. If you don't have tests yet, just say you're going to have a testathon, go and buy a bunch of inflatable animals, and sit in a room for a couple days. Just test stuff, right? Because it takes a long time to build up the amount of tests, and it can be really intimidating if there's no tests, right? It's a lot easier to add a few tests to existing code base than to go from no tests at all. But testing isn't going to catch everything, right? Testing isn't going to catch the subtle differences that can happen in terms of the padding and the sizing and all that stuff. And those differences actually matter quite a lot, right? And this is actually what I've run into the most with upgrading Bootstrap is these subtle differences in spacing. And those differences can be really, really bad, right? Like there was a change in Bootstrap which meant that our input widths were like 6 pixels less, which now means all of our numbers that people are entering are cut off and they can't see their second number. And that's basically a functional problem, right? If your user can't see their whole input that they've entered, that's bad. So CSS is not just about it's the perfect amount of white space. It's actually functionally showing you information. So you can actually have differences that happen that are hard to test for because they're purely visual. But you could actually test for this if you could do what we call like visual diff tests. So there's this cool framework called Needle, which is a way of using Selenium plus nose in Python. And what it'll do is it'll use Selenium to open up your website. It'll take a screenshot of your website, and then it'll diff it against some known screenshot that's good, right? And then you can compare the two and see what the differences is using a visual difference algorithm. So that's really cool, right? Because you could just automate this to go across your entire website and find all these differences, which would mean that I could have run this instead of sending it to a QA team who had to do this manually, right? So I think that's really cool. This isn't something that we've had time to implement yet, but if you do have Selenium tests already, then this is something I would definitely try out and see how that works. And I know there's also other people working on other perceptual diff frameworks, so I think that there's going to be a lot more of this stuff coming out, because I think more and more of us are realizing that we care about the differences between our two things. I've done even the ghetto technique, which is Photoshop, and you overlay, and you just change the color layer brightness to something like saturation difference, something like that. But that takes a while, right? So I think in the future we're all going to be running these visual diffs over our front ends every time we deploy, because it'll get more and more easy, and people will create more frameworks for doing it. But we're just getting started with that. OK, so what I want to take away from this is that CSS is actually something that really matters, right? CSS is not just something that we're styling our websites with to make them pretty. CSS affects a massive amount of things. It can affect your JavaScript, which means it can affect your functionality. It could break your entire website. It could disable people from signing in correctly, from being able to submit their quizzes. It can make it impossible for somebody to read a bit of information that they're trying to read. It could hide a modal instead of showing it. So we are using CSS for a lot, which is cool, but also really, really scary, because so much can break if we don't use CSS correctly, right? And we don't use it with protection. So that's the takeaway, is that you should really be paying attention to your CSS. Like actually, when I do code reviews these days, I pay more attention to the CSS changes in the code review than to the server-side changes. Because I know the server-side changes are pretty well tested. I know that people know that those are important. But CSS, people often think like, I'll just change this number here, no big deal, right? But it can actually be a big deal. So pay attention to your CSS. Think really carefully about how you're handling your prefixes, and how you're modularizing it, and how you're testing it, and how you're diffing it. And just remember that it actually really does matter. Thanks.